Murphy from Childhood Education International. And we're just going to go through a few housekeeping before we get started. Please note that the session will be recorded. This is a webinar session. In order to provide questions, we ask that you use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen to ask any questions, or we also very much welcome suggesting any resources relevant to the topic of the webinar. The chat feature will be used for our use as presenters and admin to be able to share information out to all of you, so information and resources. So please keep an eye on the chat. Again, in order to engage with questions, please use the Q&A feature below. We will do our best to get to your questions, but if it's something that we are not able to get to, please be rest assured that your questions help inform future conversations. So thank you for your patience. The purpose of this webinar is to support country leaders to turn data into compelling arguments and real action for investing in early childhood and building child-friendly policies. The key takeaways that we hope you have by the end of the webinar is that you'll understand the basics of ROI, or return on investment, and why it strengthens the business case for early childhood. You'll be able to identify key data and variables commonly used to make the ECD business case. You'll learn about ROI study types that can be adapted or replicated in different countries. And you'll also receive some information on skills to be able to strategically convert data to engage business leaders and policymakers. We have a very full agenda today. We've divided it into two parts. In the first part, we're currently in the opening. You'll hear welcoming remarks from our CEO, Diane Whitehead. And then you'll hear from our presenters, which we'll introduce in a minute, about what is ROI and why does it matter. We'll also be presenting a global overview of resources that you can use to make the business case for investment in early childhood. We'll take a very brief break before we start part two. And the part two is the practical side of things. So we hope you are able to stay through the end, where you'll be hearing about how you can use the data to create and adapt studies, and also you'll be hearing some strategies for being able to communicate data, and there'll be time for some final questions, and then we will close. So with that, now that you have a little bit of a roadmap of what to expect during the webinar, I'd like to introduce Diane Whitehead. She is President and CEO of Childhood Education International. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Diane.
Hello, everyone. It's so nice to have you with us today for this very important webinar. We're excited to have you joining with us. This is a really timely topic. There's a lot of discussion today about how we bring sectors together. The business sector is obviously an important sector in our world, and we want to make sure that we are paying attention to bringing them into our circle of early childhood development, to have these really important, again, and timely discussions on how we can join together to better the future of children. The response to this webinar has been amazing. We have all of you from around the world who are with us. We have several hundred people who are interested in joining us today across 70 countries and 6 continents. So thank you very much for being with us. I know for some of you, the time zone difficulties are difficult, and we certainly appreciate you joining in. There's great interest in receiving practical knowledge, resources, and support that will really help you feel more confident in making this business case for investing in ECD. And that's what we hope to do with you today. Okay. We're presenting this webinar against the backdrop of really positive global momentum and commitment for investment in ECD. Recently at the G20 summit, and you may have been sort of monitoring this a little bit yourselves, but world leaders made a commitment to increase investment in early childhood education and childcare, and they endorsed the first ever International Finance Summit for Early Childhood, which will take place in 2027. And this initiative was also announced during the UN General Assembly this past September. So just these two initiatives that we see here are movements. We can see that things are starting to change in this conversation. Certainly the commitment of world leaders to really being able to increase investment in early childhood care and education, but then also this 2027 International Financing Summit, which is really exciting. And I'm just thrilled that that will be happening soon. You'll be seeing a lot of events leading up to this financing summit in 2027 in 2026. So be on the lookout for those. The Center for Business Champions at Childhood Education International believes that sustainable investment in the early years includes creating these partnerships with business. At the Center for Business Champions, or what we call for short, the CBC, we work with ECD and business leaders to build thriving futures for all by developing their capacity to work together towards shared goals and promote economic and social well-being. We, as a global community, know that cross-sectoral collaboration is really critical for strengthening ECD systems, which includes greater investment of funding and resources. To develop those meaningful partnerships, the CBC focuses not only on why to engage business, but the much more difficult task of knowing how to do that successfully. It's very hard. We sometimes understand why we need business to be to understand ECD and to invest and support early childhood development. But how do we do that? Among our services, the CBC provides ECD and business leaders with training and tools and strategic guidance that provide the practical knowledge, the skills, the resources, and support to collaborate together. A couple of recent examples coming from our work is that we supported Brazil's an NGO in Brazil, Fundação Abrim, to build and launch their Champions for Children network. And this is a coalition of businesses through a 6-month strategic engagement. That's one of the things that we do. We help organizations or nations or communities build business coalitions focused on early childhood. Building on that momentum, we had our first 6-session online training for ECD leaders from 12 countries across 5 continents. And that was really looking at the ways that those ECD leaders could connect with business, could build relationships with business. So before I introduce our featured presenters, we want to acknowledge the thoughtful, very thoughtful questions that we've received when you registered for the event. And thank you so much for taking time to do that. It's really important for us to know what's on your mind so that we can continue to serve you and provide you with information that you need. Here's a summary of the types of questions we received. And a lot of these we can address on this webinar. Some of them, they're very important questions. We may not be able to address them on this webinar, but again, we'll be trying to provide you with consistent information as we also begin to gear up for 2026, an important year for us because it's the year before this International Finance Summit on ECD will happen. Finally, we want to address the concern that we often hear about business engagement in early childhood and in education. At the CBC, one thing we want you to know is that we focus on business engagement to advance economic and social well-being through increased investment, resources, influence, advocacy, to raise awareness about the early years and promote child and family-friendly practices. Prioritizing ECD in corporate social responsibility or ESG, environment, social, and governance practices, and potentially affecting policy change. We're not talking about the privatization or commodification of ECD. We're not talking about private childcare businesses. Okay, so that's an important way that we want you to understand to distinguish what we do. So, with that, I'm really happy to acknowledge that we have with us Dr. Sarah Watson. Dr. Sarah Watson is the Senior Advisor for our Center for Business Champions, and Dr. Clive Belfield, who's a Professor of Economics, Queen's College, City University of New York. So, welcome to both Dr. Watson and Dr. Belfield. Thank you for being with us. You're going to hear an awful lot from them today, but just know, take down some notes. We've got a deep dive into ROI, return on investment, and we will be sending you information after this webinar is over, so you'll be able to receive some follow-up information about the webinar that we had today. So thank you so much, and again, welcome.
Well, Clive and I are just delighted to see all of you here and to know the level of interest in this essential part of making the case for investments in early childhood across the world. So I want to clear, and I have used this business case data in many, many different contexts in the United States and other countries to convince skeptics that we need to invest in children just the way that in the kind of quality programs that all of you want to see. So what do we mean by business case data, including return on investment? So we mean by that quantitative evidence that can sometimes be monetized, but sometimes is not, that demonstrates the impact of a problem, such as the lack of childcare or the lack of immunization, or a solution, such as providing all young children with what they need to thrive, on outcomes that matter to business. And why does this matter? Why are we focusing on this? It provides powerful evidence of the multi-generational impacts of your work to improve the lives of young children. It can capture the attention of people in compelling new ways, and includes people who are maybe somewhat skeptical about the desire and the value of providing young children what they need. It cuts across many different audiences. It allows you to contrast investments in proven children's programs, not with other children's programs, so not pitting should we invest in healthcare or education, but with public spending on a lot of other programs, not for children, that have less evidence of effectiveness. And it complements the stories and the qualitative insights that many of you know and use all the time. One of the questions we had from the registrants was, what are the different types of metrics? You'll see some examples of these metrics, but they include employment of both parents and children, education, health, some factors of well-being, such as behavior, mother's confidence in their ability to provide for their families, etc., wages, taxes paid because of better employment participation, economic activity in a country, use of public services, and employee retention. There are other metrics, but that gives you an idea, and you'll see those in the studies that we're going to talk about. Okay, next slide. One of the things that people asked when you registered is how does using the business case data, again, of which full return on investment data is one important element, how does it fit with our desire for access, equity, and inclusion? In our longer trainings of early childhood leaders and how to build partnerships with business, we talk about the different communication styles and the different words and phrases that the different groups use. And we talk about the fact that there are a lot of overlapping goals, but sometimes they are called different things. So business case data can be used to support the type of outcomes that early childhood leaders often talk about. There are some considerations in using this data that I have, personally learned over 20 plus years of engaging the business community. You want to partner it with qualitative information, as I mentioned. We want to use analogies thoughtfully. An analogy that is very familiar to the business community is the pipeline imagery of children moving through the pipeline of education to come out at the other end with the skills and preparation to be successful adults as they define it. Sometimes that can be overused, but it is also a very powerful, comfortable analogy for business. Another one is not to over exaggerate or over promise results. Many of you may be familiar with some very famous small return on investment studies that were done in the United States that, in my personal opinion, were very powerful, but they were sometimes used in a way that implied that every program would generate these exact 17% return on investment results. And so I want to be careful about not over-promising results. We want to be careful to suggest that wages are not the only measure of success. They are a powerful measure, but not every child is going to grow up to have a position where wages are the main measure of success. Don't imply that programs have to have a large positive benefit cost ratio to be worthwhile. 2 to 1 is a great benefit cost ratio. We don't need 10 to 1. And so Clive is going to talk a little bit more about that as he is the expert in economic modeling. And then finally, look for short, medium, and long-term benefits. Somebody said, how do we balance the long-term benefits and the short-term costs? And you can find shorter-term benefits from many early childhood programs. And so that is a way to bring people along while you're also preparing for the longer-term benefits. This is a really short overview of something we discuss in much more detail in our training, but we want to make sure that you knew we were addressing it. Okay, next slide. So now we're going to shift into the next part of our presentation. And this is really the heart and the core of the presentation is we want to give you a taste of the wide variety of studies that exist out there that you can use to build your business case. And they include return on investment, but also other studies that provide elements, different types of outcomes that business cares about. And they're going to be in a graduated presentation that's going to start with studies that are widely available, many of which have data on your particular country that are free from multinational organizations. And then Yvette is going to present those studies that are global studies that provide either general information that people can use or specific country level data. I will talk about then some examples of studies that are available for multi-country situations. Those are called meta-analyses, where they combine studies from many different situations, as well as some examples of single country studies that exist that you can look for to find the kind of data that can help build the business case. There's also studies done by and for individual companies that give some evidence of the importance of family-friendly policies in particular. And then finally, Clive, our economic expert who has done many economic impact studies, is going to talk about much more comprehensive research that has been done in several different countries that provides a true cost benefit ratio or return on investment numbers. So again, we'll start with data that exists right now that you could be picking out to make your business case and go to much more sophisticated and expensive studies. And the other thing we wanted to mention is, of course, the ideal situation is to have data that is about your country. That's not always possible. So you can look for data on maybe your competitor nations, ones that are very similar to you, and your business people are always, and your politicians are looking at how do we compare to this country. Or you can look for studies that reflect data that is applicable across cultures and across countries. For example, the brain development studies. That is a biological development that, in terms of the importance of the early years in brain development, that is very compelling to business and is not based on any particular country or culture. So with that, let me turn it over to Yvette.
Thank you, Sarah. If you joined late, again, my name is Yvette Murphy. I'm Senior Advisor for Global Education with Childhood Education International. I will be doing the first part. As Sarah was saying, there's a lot of reports that I'm sure many of you are already familiar with, but putting it within the frame of just understanding that we know that the best arguments, the best stories are built upon a backdrop or a backbone of data and information. So that often can be done by drawing upon global resources and global reports and the data that's provided there. So these reports that you see on this slide come from, as Sarah was saying, international organizations, very reputable organizations such as OECD, UNICEF, and the World Bank and the World Health Organization. These are resources that very strongly connects ECD to workforce and equity and social cohesion types of outcomes and inclusion, that all of these types of outcomes appeal to a business audience beyond economic returns. So I'd like to just point out that Diane earlier was talking about the global momentum that's happening in investment for early childhood development. The Act for Early Years campaign we're highlighting here has produced important thought pieces and has been a leader in global advocacy for investment in ECD. So it's important to pay attention to the reports that they've put out. In 2023, they had a call for a global movement to support the world's youngest children. Most recently, there's a report, All Means All, a call for disability inclusive early years financing. And you can look forward to in 2026, a series of reports called Smart Buys for early childhood development. And again, those resources will be informing our conversation leading up to the 2027 investment international summit for investing in early childhood that we can look forward to. As the early years are the foundation for lifelong learning and trajectories of life, the OECD report, Reducing Inequalities by Investing in Early Childhood Education and Care, provides data on how early inequalities can lead to very divergent paths, as we know, with regards to being able to fill potential. And it provides data on investment in ECEC as a cost-effective way to close achievement gaps before those gaps widen. The report released by UNICEF and UNESCO in 2024 provides that holistic view, not just about education, but for well-being, equity, inclusion, and lifelong learning potential as a result of a strong start to life. It provides data and analysis across regions, which helps to benchmark a country's ECCE status against regional and global averages. So this report, of course, is useful for advocacy or business case comparisons that you may want to do for your particular context. And of course, another backbone document that you can use to make the case is the Nurturing Care Framework. This framework, again, provides that holistic view that defines the young children, what young children need to survive and thrive. It's based upon five areas of good health, nutrition, safety and security, responsive caregiving, and opportunities for early learning. This framework argues that ECD is not just a social or health issue, but that it's foundational for human potential, lifelong well-being, and by extension, a nation's economic and social development. Again, these reports lend credibility to any argument that you would want to make to a business for investing in ECD. There are other global data resources from which you can find country level data for early childhood. And again, you're probably already familiar with them. The country profiles for early childhood development was established to track and monitor progress in countries that face the greatest burden of maternal and child mortality. This is a wonderful resource that provides country level data, again, using the holistic nurturing care framework that we just talked about in the areas of health, nutrition, responsive caregiving, early learning, and security and safety. So be sure to check those out. Those have been recently updated just last month. Another source is the Early Childhood Development Index by UNICEF. And this index was developed to monitor progress on specifically SDG 4.2, which is the early childhood target that ensures all children and boys have access to quality early childhood development and care, and that they're ready for primary education. So the ECDI 2030, it's actually a methodological process that provides nationally representative and internationally comparable data on ECD. It provides the process to be able to collect in a standardized way early childhood indicators, and it can be integrated into national data collection efforts. So check that out. There is, if you don't already know, and there's accompanying guidance and implementation tools to support that process. Another database is the UNESCO or the Institute for Statistics or UIS World Inequality Database on Education, or WIDE. This database derives from multiple household surveys, the demographic and health surveys, the multiple indicator cluster surveys, et cetera, and it provides learning assessments from over 160 countries. So again, you can take the data from there. It allows you to compare education outcomes on several levels. And it's something that you, as Sarah was saying earlier, you can take a look at your country. You can look at countries that have similar context as yours and do some comparisons. And again, use that information to build a strong evidence case. Another interesting resource is the UIS International Standard Classification of Education Mappings and Diagrams. Now, this is something that you can just look at to see structural information of a country's education system. It would inform your broader context and status of early childhood education. And again, it could be comparative to other countries in your region with similar contexts as yours. So all really important information, a lot of really wonderful resources out there that are available for free. And there's a couple of more resources in terms of investment and really focusing in on investment for early childhood development. That's the OECD Early Childhood Education and Care Program. They provide the focus of this program is to provide policy reviews of OECD member countries, and they do international studies on early childhood learning outcomes. They look at teacher workforce in early childhood. So these are really to be able to advance investment and under the importance and of investing in the early years. So really strong information there. And then finally, the Brookings Childhood Cost Data Initiative. And this is something that you can check out. They have what we call a costing calculator where you can take early childhood interventions and there's a lot of information out there where we look at interventions and then we look at outcomes, but we don't necessarily have the data for breaking down the cost. And this might be something that where you can take interventions from the center level to the system level and really be able to look at the cost breakdown. Now, this doesn't give you the full cost benefit analysis, but it can be used with additional evidence in order to build your case. So some wonderful resources here, and I'm going to go pass it on to Sarah.
Great. Thank you, Yvette, for your research. So the good news is there is data out there, almost certainly on your country, that starts to build the business case for investment. Maybe it's the percentage of children who have access to early childhood. It's the percentage of mothers in the workforce. It's the percentage of children that get immunizations and other kinds of important health interventions. But often what's necessary is for you to go into those studies and pluck out the really important statistics that are going to be compelling to your business community. And we'll talk at the end about how to package these bits of data into a compelling business case. So on to kind of the second level of sophistication of data studies, there are a number of what the research community calls meta-analyses. So these are studies that researchers have done where they collect data across many similar or comparable smaller studies and put the data together to come out with larger impacts or broader impacts. And we're just going to give you a couple of examples. There are others out there, but just to show this as an illustration of another type of study that you can use to make the business case. So one is a study on childcare and mothers' labor market outcomes in lower and middle income countries. And this study found that of 21 of 22 studies showed an increase in women's work due to institutional childcare, and income went up in a variety of the countries studied. For example, 24% in Kenya, 16% in Brazil. And these studies are really helpful in two ways. One is that, again, they can show that these results are widespread. So if they happened in 30 different countries, they're probably applicable to your country. The other thing you can do in looking at these meta-analyses is to look at the individual studies that the researchers combined to come up with these broad results. And there may be one that is specifically on your country. Just a second example is the economic consequence of family policies, lessons from a century of high income countries. And that looked at 30 different higher income countries and found that spending on early childhood and workplace flexibility was strongly associated with an increase in women's work and a decrease in the employment gap between men and women. So we'll talk about some individual companies that found similar results, but when you can also point to the fact that this happens across many different countries, it just strengthens your argument. Okay, go on to the next slide. So the next type of studies that we're going to look at are ones that, again, just examples of research on individual countries. And this is quite powerful to the business community. And again, if you can't find a study on your individual country, if you can find one on a country with similar demographics or a country that your business community considers to be kind of a competitor country, that can also be persuasive. So, and again, as Ashley said, and I said, all of these citations are on the last few slides of our presentation, so you will get all of them. So you don't have to worry about scrambling to write down a citation. So this study, for example, looked at Vietnam and looked at the impact of childcare on childcare and maternal employment, and found that it improved women's probability of working in a wage earning job as opposed to kind of an informal barter economy by 41%, which is a huge increase. It also helped women move from farm work, which can be very low paying and not have a good path for advancement, to more formal employment by 26%. It also showed an increase in women's total annual wages and household income per capita. So these are really important outcomes that are important to the business community as well as to early childhood leaders. One other thing I wanted to point out about this study is that it wasn't a whole new research study that had to be commissioned and carried out over a number of years. It used the Vietnam Household Living Standards Survey over the last several years. So it used existing data. And many of your countries may have regular studies that happen, and just no one has analyzed the data in this way, or no one has put the data specifically in the context of making the case for early childhood. So there's probably a lot of data sitting on the shelf that you could use to make the business case. Okay, going to the next slide. So here's another study that looked at the impact of rural childcare provision in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. This was a randomized controlled trial. So that means a study where people were randomly assigned to get childcare or not get childcare, probably because of limitations. They couldn't offer it to everybody. So those are very powerful studies because you can show that the impacts are due to the treatment or the program or the intervention, which is getting childcare. So this is community-based childcare for children aged 2 to 6, and 73% of the people that had the opportunity to use the childcare used it. So that's a powerful indicator of demand. Showed a dramatic increase in household income. It showed that the impact of women on women was particularly strong, more likely to farm commercial crops, more likely to work in non-farm jobs, and an increase in their income. And we know data shows that increases in women's income often filters down to the children. It also had good impacts on men. They increased in work in commercial farming and in entrepreneurship. And it also measured improvements in young children's development. And to the degree to which, if you have studies that look at the impacts on young children, if you can translate that into later development that affects children's ability to be productive adults, that can be very powerful. Okay, next slide. So the next type of study that we want to look at is done by individual companies. And there are many examples out there and of companies that have been willing to measure the impacts of family-friendly policies and childcare on their own employees. And again, 'cause there are millions of companies out there, doesn't have to be a study on the company you're aiming for or the company even in your country. But if you can find a study on a company that's somewhat similar to the ones you're trying to build a partnership with, that can be very powerful. So here's an example from the International Finance Corporation. There are also many other organizations, the Center for Child Rights, for example, that have good studies on individual companies that looked at the impact on absences after a workplace creche was open. That's a 9% reduction in use of sick leave is really significant. And then a second example in Brazil that showed that childcare benefits were associated with a reduction in accident rates. And of course, accident rates hurt the employee's family, and the company. And they feel it was attributable to having access to good quality childcare. So having these studies and having business people from these companies say, I really believe this data can be a very powerful argument for business leaders to support both their own family-friendly policies as well as public policies that support child care and child health. Okay. So now I'm about to turn it over to Clyde Belfield, and I'm going to praise Clyde because he's kind of modest. In that I've worked with Clyde for the last 20 plus years in developing economic impact studies on the impact of the lack of childcare, in particular on businesses, on families, on taxpayers in the United States. He is, I'm confident in saying he is one of the most wonderful economists I have ever worked with. He understands economics. He also understands early childhood, which is pretty rare in a world-class economist. He's also very funny, has a wry sense of humor, can explain things that so that I understand them. And it's just been a delight to work with him over many years. And his work has made a tremendous impact on our ability to advocate. Clive, see, I told you. So I'll just say that the study that he's going to talk about, that he was the brains behind, generated more than 1,000 media hits in the United States because the results were so powerful. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Clyde, who can stop blushing now and tell you about some much more sophisticated and honestly expensive studies, but they're ones that are very powerful, showing the impact of early childhood. Thank you, Clive.
Thank you, Sarah. So that was a very nice introduction. I am reminded of what Lyndon Johnson said when somebody said something nice about him. He said, I wish my parents had been here to hear that because my dad would have loved it and my mum would have actually believed it. So, welcome to the economics of early childhood. What we're going to do here is ROI to economists means dollars. It means dollars. And we're going to put everything in dollars, and we're going to acknowledge that dollars is one metric. It's one metric. It's not a complete metric. It's not a precise metric for measuring what we're trying to do, but it is one metric that is compelling to business leaders, policymakers, and compelling to parents when they see how much early education costs them. So I'm going to go through 3 studies. There are a lot of studies out there. And I'm going to just go through three and talk a little bit about each one, highlight um, the findings, not so much the numbers, but the findings. And then after the break, we'll talk a little bit about the mechanisms underlying the findings. So there are um, the first study is this one from the UK, and there's a parallel slide after this one. What is the idea here? The idea here is that uh, childcare frees up parents to work, and those parents can work and they can be more productive, and they'll pay taxes when they work on their tax labor income. And so investing in early childhood is basically an active labor market policy. And we can talk about the social and emotional skills for the children, which is important. And we could talk about the how the children progress through school. That's also important. And this study does some of that on the, as you can see on the by the pie chart there. And and then and those are important, but we can focus, and it's helpful to focus just for a moment on what it means for working parents and for the labor market more generally. And then once you've talked about working parents and the labor market, you naturally think, what does it mean for um, the business, and also what does it mean for the tax system? And so these numbers indicate pretty high annual benefits for wages, business profits, and tax revenues from investing in early childhood in the UK. So I won't go into the numbers, but this is kind of the one part of the framework of thinking about their parents and their children, and we can treat those as streams of capital that are going to yield us a money value in whatever currency we're in. So if we move on to the next slide. Now, once you start thinking about the labor market and what does it mean for parents who've now got time to invest in the labor market, you can do a lot of analyses within the labor market. You can look at how many people are employed, and you can look at how much their employment would generate in terms of gross value added, gross domestic product, or income. And then you can look at the wages that these workers will experience in relation to any given policy change in early childhood. So certainly once you've got this framework of let's look at the parents, you can look in a lot of detail about how the labor market would change. And the good thing for economists is this is all measured in currency. So it becomes now more like an accounting exercise than a discussion of the social and emotional benefits of early education. And we're not going to make an apology for that. We're just going to say this is one focus that politicians and business leaders are very interested in. So that's the study for the United Kingdom. Now, in order to get a full, comprehensive understanding of the return on investment to preschool, we have to look at how it affects all different groups and put those together, and we put those all in money terms as well. So don't worry too much about the exact numbers, more the relationships between the numbers. And this table looks a bit complicated, but this is really the entire table. So it's a summary table, but this is kind of the entire summary of the study, all put together in one table with 5 rows and 3 columns. So the first thing we do in our return on investment is we say, well, who's getting the return? And that's our first column. And so children are getting a return, parents are getting a return, the government is getting a return, and businesses are getting a return. And the total return would be the sum of these 4 groups, making sure we don't double count anything. But really, these are the 4 groups that we're interested in for a return on investment. So it's not that many groups. We don't want to make it into too many groups. We would just keep it very simple in terms of children, parents, government, and business. And then we just list all the costs that each group, each perspective faces, and then all the benefits that each perspective accrues. And so obviously the children are not paying for the preschool themselves, so they don't have any costs. And what are the benefits to the preschoolers? Well, over the lifetime, they get a lot of wages, extra wages. The literature on the benefits of preschool and human capital is enormous and growing every hour. So there's a lot of literature there, but it's primarily a function of wages that children get over the lifetime as a result of having more human capital from going to preschool. That will depend on the quality of the preschool, but that's kind of the logic that we're looking at. There's a little wrinkle that if you get paid more, you're less eligible for welfare. So we have to take that off for the children, but it's a trivial component relative to the size of the wage gain over the lifetime for the children. And we treat that as an investment. So it's a lump sum amount that we capitalize. Like when you buy a house, you look at the value of the house and then you capitalize that into a mortgage. It's kind of the same lump sum framework. So that's for the children. So we can think of the child benefits as an economist purely in this instrumental labor market way. For the parents, now in this Australia case, the parents are paying out-of-pocket fees for the preschool, for some of the preschool, not the entire amount. Is roughly about 20% of the fees are paid. The cost of the preschool is paid for by the parents. That's going to vary from place to place. The optimal fee structure is not it's not established. It's going to vary from country to country, but certainly the optimal fee structure is unlikely to be zero payment by the parents. So the parents are going to have a out-of-pocket fees to pay, but they themselves get benefits in that they have more time freed up to work themselves. And if you look at those two numbers there, you can see 501 to 1463, without getting bogged down into the precise numbers, we're looking at a pretty clear benefit for parents purely as a function of subsidized childcare, allowing them to work. And that's a number that will vary from country to country, and we'll talk a little bit about that after the break. But you can see the kind of magnitudes that we're talking about here, out-of-pocket fees versus own employment and wages. And the important thing about treating this as a labor market policy is that these are immediate benefits. So even though everything's expressed correctly in terms of an investment, you don't actually see the money for the children until the children are grown up. Whereas the parents, if you give them preschool, early education opportunities, they can go out and work straight away. So that looks like an immediate benefit. That is an immediate benefit to the families as a result of being able to work more. So that's the parental calculus. And also, of course, you can think, well, parents and children kind of go together, so we should really think about those together. But in economics, it's helpful to just treat them as separate money streams. Okay, so that's perspective number two. We got to go back. We're only halfway through. We're going to move. Thank you. This is professor mode, so we keep going until we've said everything. So the third perspective is the government. And the government in Australia pays for most of the preschool. So 20% is paid by parents, but 80% is paid for by the government. And it is paid for, it's a distributed payment model. So it's not all paid for by the central government. There are local payments and there are some minor school expenditures. So in this context, you would allocate money to the school and then the school would allocate that money to the preschool, perhaps by buildings or facilities or some teachers. But it's not it's not necessarily a centralized government, and it's not necessarily a local government. And the burden between the two is probably a function of political power, but most countries would have some kind of cost sharing between central government and state local government. The optimal area for a preschool policy, I don't know what that is, but it's probably not countrywide. So some state local payments are probably appropriate. And in this context, state territory payments are greater than central government payments, but they're both pretty large. So that's what it costs the government to fund the preschool. What does the government get from this preschool? Well, it gets all of the consequences that it would have had to pay for if the children had not gotten the human capital that they're getting as a result of the early education preschool. So education helps kids become more healthy. You can particularly think of that if you're bundling early care and education with a vaccination program, immunization program, just health education programs, particularly for families who don't have access to healthcare at home. So there are a lot of healthcare savings. There are tax revenue savings when the children grow up. And they pay extra taxes. So you can think of the wages over the lifetime and the tax revenues as parallel benefits. And there are also tax revenues from the parental wages too. And you need the tax code for that, but it's not that it's not that complicated to calculate one's tax bill. I say that given that my tax bill always seems incredibly complicated, but it's doable. So you can calculate the tax revenues for child lifetime wages and parental wages, and then you get the welfare savings back too. So you see that plus 67 minus 67 there. And then on the left-hand side of the benefits of preschool for the government, there's the healthcare savings. There's also criminal justice system savings. Those can include delinquency. So these amounts are lump sums. So there are lump sums at the age of preschool. So you can think of this as like the way your house is valued as a lump sum or a certificate of deposit is valued as a lump sum. So these are not annual amounts. These are collapsed all the way back to the start of life. That seems complicated, but it's really just an actuarial accountancy calculation. So delinquency crime could be important. It's going to vary from system to system, but the government is certainly on the hook for paying for most of the consequences of criminal activity and delinquency. And then there are some school savings, grade repetition, special education reduction as a result of preschool. So you can see there's a bundle of benefits to the government and a large proportion of costs. And in terms of doing the math, it really is benefits minus costs. As long as you've got them in the same framework, it's really just the blue numbers minus the red numbers. It's that it's that framework. So once you have the framework set up, it's relatively easy to do the numbers. Well, it's very easy to do the numbers. It's just blue minus red numbers. Okay, we can't forget the guys at the bottom because the ROI is return on investment, and the investment might be by the business community. Now, in this Australia example, the business community doesn't pay for preschool, but there's no reason why the business community wouldn't pay for some component of the preschool. There could be some cost sharing here. So that would be the costs. And then the benefits would be a function of the children being more productive and the parents being more productive. And that would add up to generalized worker productivity gains for the business. And that's important for the business community because the business community wants its workers to be productive. And as anybody who's struggled with childcare knows, it's quite hard to be productive if you're constantly worried or having to deal with inadequate, incomplete, zero childcare. And that's been a big focus in the US and the US studies, and in particular one that I was involved in, which is the next slide. And that is brief pause. And that is a study which simply looks at what happens when you have an inadequate childcare system and parents are struggling to find care that is affordable. They're struggling to find care that is accessible, so simply has enough spots, has spots close by, has spots that fit your work schedule or your life work balance, and has spots that are sufficient quality. So we haven't talked about the returns to quality investment, but certainly parents are going to be worried if their children are going to a day childcare center and it's not really helping them. They're just napping or not really doing anything that's developmentally appropriate. So parents worry about finding affordable, accessible, and quality childcare. And that's been a constant in the US for a long time. And I suspect the US is not an outlier, but certainly there's a lot of investigation of how concerned parents are about inadequate childcare. So when we look at this, in this study, which is being revised, and there's a new version of this study coming out in early 2026, same framework, same ideas, but kind of after the pandemic, current policy situation. And so the worker productivity sounds like, well, wait a minute, businesses, okay, you get more workers because they're not worried about their childcare, but what does the business really get from that? And these studies are surveys, and the surveys are surveys of parents, and you simply ask parents, what are the problems you face at work as a result of inadequate childcare? And I guess I should have known this, having had children and a job. The list is incredibly long. So parents report that they're distracted at work. Parents report that they have to leave work early. They also sometimes have to start work late. They miss shifts. They miss entire work days when they don't have childcare. And that's for parents who are already working. So you're working and the childcare is inadequate and it pulls you out of work. You miss work, you leave early, you're distracted at work. Those are features of immediate productivity. And then these surveys bring out what is also part of a business case is this is a world of investment where you can have immediate problems, but you also end up with longer term problems too. And so we ask parents, and parents report, yeah, I had to quit my job, or I got fired from my job, I got demoted from my job, I had my hours cut, I got reprimanded by my supervisor, I myself cut my hours preemptively because I knew that my childcare was not going to be sufficient for me to work. And over the long term, parents report, yeah, I couldn't take part in training and I couldn't take part in career promotions and job opportunities. So what we see is a incredibly multifaceted concern that parents have with their ability to work in a world where childcare is either not available or is inadequate. And the employer, the business, is not immune from that. The business suffers when its workers are distracted or its workers have to quit or scale back. And because we know people's wages, we can figure out what happens when they do quit and what happens when they have to scale back their work. And that's what this slide gives us here. It gives us a measure of the annual parental cost of inadequate childcare when you have a child under 3. And in the US, this is in 2022 dollars, it's about $5,500 per working parent if they have a child under age 3. Now, average income is about $60,000 there. So it's like a 1 in a 12th, almost 10% of your income effectively is diminished as a result of inadequate childcare. And that's expressed per year. Now, when we go down from the parents will pay taxes, and the business will also suffer. And we can calculate what businesses suffer. Now, businesses suffer in two ways. They have lower worker productivity and they have a churning workforce. So you have to quit because your childcare is inadequate, or you have to cut back your hours. And businesses suffer from lower productivity and hiring, managerial, and recruitment costs. And you can add those up, and those are in economics non-trivial numbers. Uh, we estimated them at $1,640 per year per child under age 3. Now, parents in the US pay taxes, and the taxes kick in pretty early in your labor market, in your earnings profile. So there's a significant burden on the taxpayer too. That's a per year number, but of course, children aren't per year. You have children at 0, and then you have them again at 1, 2, and 3, and this keeps going on. And so these burdens are annual, but the green numbers give you a total expression for the US economy and over time. So these are studies. I don't want to make them sound too complicated. The perspectives are pretty straightforward: parents, businesses, taxpayers, and children. And there is some challenge in making sure that numbers over time can be collapsed back into annual amounts. But that's more like an actuarial problem than it is a kind of a theory problem. So I think we're right at time. So these are the studies. When we get back after the poll, Sarah and I will talk more about the mechanisms underlying this and the data challenges we need. So more like practical things about how to do these types of studies. So Yvette, I'm going to hand it over to.
Let me just add one thing,
Oh,
Clive. You're amazing. It's so wonderful. And you might wonder, what these studies on Australia, UK, and the US have to do with you. And I guess the point that we wanted to send to you is that this methodology could potentially be applied to other countries. And after the break, Clive is going to talk generally about what it takes to do an economic model, and again, generally about how these methodologies of a variety of studies could be used in a variety of countries. And Yvette, I see we have two questions in the question and answer that I'm happy to take a crack at, and then also invite, look like we do have a new one, but then Clive and you could also comment on, it says women's work does not necessarily translate in good outcomes for children. Do you know of studies that study the relationship between childcare and mom's employment, and child development outcomes? And what I want to say about this, this debate comes up in the United States, obviously, and other countries. But essentially, in many, many situations, women have to work. There really is no other choice in order to support the family. And so when this question comes up, what we talk about is we want to use the evidence to make the case for quality childcare, because, of course, poor childcare and early education is not great for children. But quality childcare, which can look different in different countries, is associated with better child outcomes. And we can use the business community to make this case for quality because they understand it in their own companies. More highly skilled employees who are paid better tend to stay on the job, and do better for the company. So let me just pause there and say that, or Clive, anything you want to add to that question before we look
So
at.
similarly to that question, and it was answered in the Q&A, is that, so it was from Andrea, and that one of the indicators uh, for investing in early childhood is increased ability of caregivers and parents to remain in the workforce. But what about attachment and relational security? Should we be promoting more time with children? And so we addressed that. It's similar to what you were saying, Sarah. But my response was, of course, work-life balance is important. The evidence the child development and neuroscience research can be used to make the case for more family-friendly policies, and therefore that promote attachment, time, and care, and all the things that we know um, children need for a quality start to life. And the key thing is making that connection for businesses about what that means for lifelong learning outcomes, what that means for fulfilling human potential, and being able to communicate that in, ways businesses can understand. And that's coming up later. Sarah's going to give some tips on that. And just that's, my response. And Sarah and Clive, if you have any else to add.
I want to go to the second question about
Mhm.
incomplete data and particularly have Clive respond to this.
Mhm.
Many countries, period, face challenges with incomplete or fragmented national data. So what do you do? Policy on everything is made on incomplete data, whether it's on how to spend money on roads or trade policy, or healthcare policy or anything else is made on incomplete data. So we want to make sure we're not holding ECD to a higher standard than we countries use to make policies about everything. Economic models and this research does not rely on measuring every person, as Clive is going to talk about after the break. So use what you have proudly. Use data from competitor nations. You can use studies on maybe one city population or regional population and not say automatically the numbers apply, everywhere in your country, but they're an illustration to think that these investments will have business relevant outcomes. And as we'll talk about at the very end, is you can supplement data with statements from economists and business people who understand the limitations of data and who've said, I'm not an expert in early childhood, but I'm an expert in understanding research. And I think this research is solid and applies to our country. So Clive, is there anything else you want to add to that?
So I'm cautious about keeping us on time.
Mhm.
I think Maria's question is a good one, but actually, economists we are pretty lean. We don't actually like a lot of metrics. So the amount of data that we think we need um, is actually much smaller than the amount of data that typically one would think one needed to collect. So I'm not certainly we need good quality data, but the amount of data is probably surprisingly small for making an ROA case. The ROA case is not supposed to be complicated, but we'll talk about that after the break, Maria, because I'm cautious that we're a little bit behind.
So I'm going to go ahead before we go into the break. Just going to launch a poll. Um, it's checking in with how you agree with this statement. The presentation of resources has increased my confidence in finding data to make the business case for investment in early childhood development. It's from strongly agree to strongly disagree, and if you're not sure, that's fine too. Great. So I think most of you strongly agree, and that makes us feel good. We're going into a break right now, and there's more to talk about in terms of practical use of the data. So stick with us. We're gonna take a 5-minute break. Actually, coming back at about just after at 22 minutes after the hour. So it's more like 4 minutes. Thank you. you strongly agree or agree, and a few of you are not sure, and that's fair for sure. So more to come. Maybe things will start to make sense as we go into part two. In part two, we will be Clive will be discussing how to create and adapt studies that we've been talking about, and then Sarah will come back and give us some strategies for communicating ROI data, and we'll have some time for a little bit of time for final questions, and then we'll close. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Clive.
Thanks, Yvette. So we've talked about the results of some of these surveys. Now we're going to dig back in and how to create one for making the business case and ROI studies. And this is quite general because we have so many countries represented, but hopefully we can get some kind of just overview thoughts so that you can apply these in your own context. So inevitably, we're going to have to collect some survey data. And so the first question is, what is our sampling frame? What are the groups we're looking at? And the first thing we immediately think of is, should we do a countrywide survey or a region-specific survey? And that's going to depend on two main things, really. One is how the early care is funded. Now, most countries, there's some cost sharing between local and the state and local versus the country. So there's some cost sharing, but that's going to vary from place to place. And that's going to drive whether we want to do a regional survey or state survey versus a national survey. The second component for deciding about country versus regional survey is the labor market. And urban and rural labor markets are very different. And we've emphasized that a lot of early education is focused on helping people to progress in the labor market. And so if your urban and rural labor markets are very different, you might be thinking about regional surveys that target urban versus rural families. And then whether we're going to do a survey to the parent or the child, or not included here, the business. It's quite hard to do surveys of businesses, so that's not on this list, but clearly the businesses are important and their perspectives are important. And so surveys of businesses are an important third approach here. Now, obviously, the child survey refers to the child as they progress through. So, and those are more like administrative records or reported either by the school or the parent. But that statement there, that distinction there is really, are we interested in what the parents are up to, or are we interested in what the children are up to? And we have to tailor our survey according to which group. Now, I've made some case that you can get a lot of mileage out of just focusing on what it means for parents. And in our surveys, we find that you don't need that large a sample in order to get a pretty precise and unbiased estimate of what is going on for parents. And the parents are the workers, so they are driving a lot of the discussion here, even if the context is within the business world. We're talking about, well, the business is worried about its workers. It's not worried about its capital, it's worried about its workers, and that's the parents. So parental surveys are a very good place to start in terms of getting data. Now, the next question is, well, this is an investment, so do we just want to look at it at a point in time, cross-sectionally, or do we want to look at it over time? Now, I think obviously we're going to have to start cross-sectionally, and then the question is whether we build it up. You can get a lot of mileage out of cross-sectional surveys because workers have educational earnings trajectories. And those are pretty standard across people. So if you know what sort of a hit somebody takes to their work, you can kind of model that forward pretty straightforwardly. So uh, part of this slide is an attempt to try to kind of make this easier. And so it was, if we were having tips to make it easier, I think we would say go with a cross-sectional survey of parents as workers, where you can use that information to project forward longitudinally. Okay, what is in this survey? Well, what is in this survey is really three things. The demographics of the families. Now, this is going to vary from country to country. Demographics matter. So, racial demographics, marital status demographics, household size demographics, those are going to matter, but that's not too many questions to ask people. What is your household size? What is your, how many people are working? How many children of a certain age? So those are kind of basic demographic questions. Now, Marc-Antoine asked, does it matter whether you're asking mothers or fathers? Surprisingly, perhaps not surprisingly, given that I am a father, fathers do tend to volunteer similar opinions to mothers, even though the mothers are the ones who are impacted most in the labor market. So the results are much stronger for mothers than for fathers, but a lot of the household is a combination of the burdens placed on mothers and the respective responses of fathers. So we it would be preferable to do a kind of a family household survey rather than a maternal survey, even though the results are always going to be much stronger for mothers. The second thing we need to know is the amount of childcare that is available in the context of the families. And typically, we try to keep that quite general. So hours of care and types of care, home-based care, relative care, getting it into a quality measure is probably overly complex for these types of economic studies. We don't really know the return to the quality of care. And if you're a parent and you have to leave work early, it doesn't really matter if you're leaving work early to deal with low quality care or high quality care in terms of the metrics for care. So that's not too many questions either. And then the key questions really are the labor market questions. What is happening to parental work? And how does that translate into lifetime wage profiles? And those can be modeled. And then the last and that's true for the business framework too. The last component is really the government component, and we typically treat that as you've got all this information about parents' work. You've got all this information about business productivity. What would it mean in the tax code? So you apply the tax code and you go to the government website and you say, my income is this, my income is this minus a certain amount. What is the tax? What are the tax implications of that? So that's more like an internet kind of activity than it is a direct research activity.
Getting good airfare deals with that.
So in terms of the mechanisms that we're interested in the survey, the mechanisms that we're interested in the survey for the business case are primarily the availability, access, and affordability of care into how it translates into parental labor market outcomes. So by that, I mean, if care is accessible for parents, the impact on the labor market is going to be weaker. If care is inaccessible, the impact on the labor market is going to be stronger. But we also do it the other way too. If most parents are working, inadequate care is a big problem. If many parents are not working or working part-time, then inadequate care is less of a problem. So it's a care availability to parental labor market mechanism. That's what we're interested in working out. And once we have the parental labor market consequences, then we have the consequences for businesses and productivity and taxes. And then the other mechanism, which is the much more the educational mechanism, is what is the relationship between the quality of the care and child outcomes? And that's going to take us a little bit far afield in today, but that's the other relationship. I think if I was doing my survey, I would kind of think, which mechanism do I really want to draw out here? Is it care availability or care quality? So those are the factors I would consider in the business case. Now, it seems like a lot, but it's really not that many questions to ask parents. And so the framework is not that complicated to ask parents about. Okay, what's next? So where can you get this data from? Well, certainly you can get data from the global organizations that Yvette has already talked about. There are studies from countries that are similar to your country. It's a it's one has to do that cautiously because labor markets vary a lot from country to country. Childcare varies a lot from country to country, and also norms about what types of childcare are available, accessible, vary from country to country. Tax codes vary from country to country. So it is possible to generalize from countries that are similar, but you need to generalize on the important metrics that in which your country is similar to other countries. There are studies around, and as Sarah mentioned earlier, there is a lot of generalizable work on neuroscience and school readiness and health benefits that are not country specific. Now, this data is actually not too difficult to collect, particularly if there is no study available in your country. And there are agencies, economists, accounting firms, notably with corporate social responsibility. And if you can find companies willing to study, that also has some compelling case about the relationship between childcare and work. Again, we're keen to make sure everything is put in the local currency. So insofar as these existing studies don't really have economic values that relate to your economic conditions. So for example, in the US, healthcare is unbelievably expensive. Then the one has to do one's own study for one's own region, locality. So on the one hand, it's not that much work to do one's own study. It's not an incredibly complicated study to find out what's happening in the early childhood space for parents and firms. But on the other hand, there is a lot of local conditions that matter. So on to my last slide. Now, the ROI is really supposed to be quite simple. It's supposed to be we invest some money and we get a return on that investment. And we just have to make sure that we calculate the numbers right, but actually, putting down $100 and getting $150 back, it's a pretty easy way to calculate the return on that investment. And it really does just come from how many children are moved into early education, early childhood education or care, and what is the benefit per child. It's quite a modular sense. Sarah referred to the pipeline. It is quite a kind of a pipeline framework where the more children that are moved and the size of the benefit per child gives you the total benefit of childcare. And this sounds kind of obvious, but as you all know, when you study childcare, a lot of families have patchwork childcare, and that's what we see typically in the US. We typically see home care, and then center-based care is available, and families add the center-based care to the home care. They don't substitute from one to the other. They use a mix of care alternatives. So actually figuring out how children have moved into childcare versus alternatives to childcare is not as straightforward as it sounds. It's not like it's not a kind of a widget model, which economists like. It is much more contextual. The size of the benefit per child is going to vary, but from the workforce perspective, the workforce framework is really about the childcare frees up the parent to work. And as a result, if your child is in care for an hour, each parent will kind of get an hour's worth of benefits. So the benefits will not vary too much depending on the child characteristics. So it doesn't matter if your child is 2 or 3 or has special needs or otherwise. The benefits are primarily conditioned on the freeing up the parents to work. So those are the benefits kind of framework. The cost framework is really just twofold. Businesses contribute some funding for childcare, but not a huge amount. It's mostly either government funding or parental funding. And we simply add up those amounts per child. And then we simply compare the benefits to the costs, like the Australia study. And we do deliberately try to keep it very simple, like that Australia table would be enough for an economist, as kind of the entire front page of your report would just be that table. And everybody could dig into each of the numbers, but the whole framework is there in that table. And we're going to take a very economics approach. We're just going to say economists don't like waste, and what we like is efficiency. And efficiency is where we spend money on childcare and we get returns that are greater than the amount we spent, because this is an investment. So if I was doing one of these, where would I look to do one? Well, I would look to one where there's an opportunity for the parents and also the children later on to apply their skills. So we want it says here, a strong labor market allows children parents to apply their skills. What we mean is we want childcare that does help the children, but helps the parents who can then go out to work. So we would need a labor market where there are opportunities for parents and particularly for mothers to get employment. And Sarah has mentioned most families rely on 2 incomes. So even if there's not a formal labor market there are some returns to childcare, freeing up parental time. And then obviously there are going to be more benefits when baseline early care and education is sparse, which I guess we could just put everywhere there, because certainly in the US we have an accessibility problem, we have an affordability problem, and to some extent we have an adequacy problem. And working is 40-hour, full-time work is 40 hours a week, and it's very difficult for any family to find childcare that covers 40 hours a week. So you can think that even if you have a country where you have a robust childcare sector, that is typically not going to cover a full working week or even and certainly not a full working year. But generally, to the extent that early education is not available, you're going to get the biggest benefits when you introduce more early education. So, Sarah, Yvette, I think I've covered as much as I can cover in the time we have. And certainly we'll be taking questions later.
Great. Thank you so much, Clive. It's been so valuable to have such a great economist join us. So, Yvette, I just wanted to take a minute. I know we're a little bit behind time, but I can squeeze. I wanted to see if we could answer the question from Marc Antoine about when we say the lack of ECD services impacts parents' career progress. Do you have data showing if women and men are impacted differently? And Clive, for example, I couldn't remember if the Ready Nation studies I know they looked at the impact of the primary caregiver, which is often, but not always, women. Do you remember if any of these studies looked at the careers of women versus men differently?
So there are the US studies, we do have primary caregiver and we have mothers and fathers. And obviously you get a lot more information from the mothers and probably more accurate information too. What typically happens in practice is kind of a default specialization that somebody stays home and somebody works more hours. So there is a bit of a bifurcation there in the parental role, but that partly reflects the fact that the childcare is inadequate in the first place, and somebody has to stay home or deal with inadequate childcare. So we do have different numbers. They're not as different as you might think for women and men, but they are different in terms of career penalties for women um, versus men.
And I know some of the country studies that I mentioned at the beginning look at the impacts versus on women versus men's income. So I think we need to move on. I know there's at least one more question that might be more than we can tackle right now, but all of this wonderful, wonderful data that you've heard about is useless unless you communicate it in a way that is compelling, easy to understand, and incites action by both business people and policymakers. And again, this comprehensive training that Diane mentioned, a 6-week training that we do, goes into much more detail about how to communicate to business. So this is just the surface suggestions. So one is to extract headlines from these dense academic papers. Those nuggets that I gave you in the beginning were literally taken out of 30-page dense academic journals that no business person is going to take the time to read. So make it short, make it snappy for them. Use numbers when possible. That just shows that these results are more solid rather than just say more or less. When you can, translate findings into outcomes that matter to business and policymakers and that people can really understand. For example, of course, breastfeeding has benefits for babies, very concrete benefits, but the impact for the employers is that it tends to reduce employee absenteeism, which is good for everyone. It does not take away from the value of breastfeeding for babies to say there are these other benefits as well. Another one, if you can translate children's test results, well-being, development into outcomes that people who are not early childhood experts can understand, will make it much more powerful. I remember in the United States, this beautiful randomized controlled trial study that provided early childhood intervention, followed the children for 18 years, and didn't ask them if they were more likely to graduate from secondary school. It gave them tests that were really meaningless outside the academic community. In your communications, use imagery and analogies that are familiar to business. One aspect that's very popular in the United States now is talking about childcare as infrastructure that is every bit as important to economic and social well-being as roads and bridges and parks and other aspects of what makes a good quality of life. We can go to the next slide. Use caveats appropriately. A lot of academics will, by necessity, put a lot of cautions about their data. And of course, we don't want to say that a number that applies to a study of 100 people applies literally to a population of 100 million people, but you can often find ways to relay the data in a way that appropriately reflects cautions, but doesn't get buried. The data doesn't get buried in too many cautions. One of the best ways to augment these numbers is to add statements from business-friendly leaders, organizations, media. That especially a lot of questions have been about what if our data is incomplete or we don't have a lot of data. It is still very powerful when you have people outside the early childhood community, from the business community, from economists, from media that speaks to business that says, we've looked at the data that we have, and we think this is an important issue for the well-being of our entire country. So in our country and around the world, having a statement from the Harvard Business Review says something. And there's another lovely statement from a wonderful organization in Kenya that has done a terrific job at mobilizing their business community to support breastfeeding in particular. So it's very powerful to have a statement from someone from Isuzu, obviously completely outside the early childhood community, that says this is a really important issue for our business. And then create a summary. Business people have a very short attention span. Policymakers have a very short attention span, and having these wonderful detailed reports is a great foundation on which to build your advocacy argument. But often people will not read past 1 or maybe 2 pages. So create a summary and use wonderful, compelling graphics. And the next slide is an example of this that Yvette found from Nigeria. It was a wonderful study that makes the business case for investing in childcare, and it illustrates many of these pieces of advice. It pulls out individual pieces of data, puts them in graphics that are easy to understand. It has a 2-page executive summary on top of a very detailed report. It uses endorsements from the business community that adds weight to the data. So I'm going to turn it over to Yvette now to close, but before I do, I just want to say that we would love to collect more examples of the business case. So whether you have a 1-page piece that you have put together or a 100-page report, we want the Center for Business Champions to be a hub for the best information and data communicated in a variety of ways to convince business and policymakers to invest in the whole array of early childhood programs, from prenatal care to family leave to childcare, etc. So please send us your examples in any language. We'll figure out how to translate them and understand them. And we would love to showcase your good work on the Center for Business Champions website. So with that, Yvette, I'm turning it over to you with thanks.
Great. Thank you there. And my sound is on. Great. So if you have any further questions, please feel free to drop that into the Q&A feature. We're probably not going to be able to get to that today, but again, your questions, whether through registration or during the session itself, does inform future conversations and helps to actually make our trainings better so that we know what it is that you would like to know. So to wrap things up, a little bit about the Center for Business Champions that Diana already talked about. Please feel free to contact us about our services. And actually, Sarah, would you like to talk a little bit more about the services, and then I'll do the contact us page.
Great. So we wanted to just give you a sense for the practical tools that we can offer. Many of you know the value of engaging the business community. As Yvette said in the beginning, we are all about the how, just the practical advice on how you build a relationship with the business community, how you find business leaders that may work with you, how you build that relationship, how you mobilize them to advocate for public policies as well as private practices. So we offer online training for individual countries, groups of people in individual countries that want to create their own business network, as well as cross-country training that can be relevant for people from a whole continent, like Africa, a region, or a multi-country situation. And that covers the topics that I mentioned before, how to really understand the business community, how they are different from the early childhood professional culture, and how you develop this relationship. We also are able to offer workshops and advisory services for business leaders that may want to include early childhood in their CSR work. We know early childhood has not always been a major part of companies' CSR, corporate social responsibility, or ESG work. And so we want to help them see how important this is for all of their goals, regardless of the industry that they are in, and how they can play an important role that crosses many different sectors. We want them to invest, but also we want them to be public policy champions and change their own policies. And as I mentioned, we want to be a hub for this work. Again, the practical tools about how to engage the business community. So sorry about that. As well as the evidence that you all are using across the world. So please send us your examples so we can showcase your great work. And with that, Yvette, I'm going to turn it back to you to close.
Thanks, Sarah. I just like to thank Professor Clive Belfield and Dr. Sarah Watson for this really informative deep dive into making the business case for investing in early childhood. Hopefully, for our wonderful audience that spans 70 countries and 6 continents, that that you were able to take something away from this webinar. And I know a few of you weren't sure, but hopefully by the second half, you got some really strong practical tips of how to use the studies and also how to communicate the evidence effectively to businesses. Please check out our website provided there. You can use the QR code. We have a great team behind the Center for Business Champions. I am the staff lead, Yvette Murphy, and you can get to me directly using the CBC email there. And Sarah was talking about sharing resources with us. You can send those to that email directly and we'll receive them. So with
I
that,
want to just mention, we'll send out the recording, right?
yep, we'll be sharing information out, including the recording and the slides, and we'll be
All those citations
yeah,
are at the end of the PowerPoint. And we also want to plug for doing the evaluation that Yvette will send out.
right.
Very quick. And this is the way that we get support to continue to offer this good content, is for people, you to say that this is valuable.
Yes. And so when you log off, a Zoom survey should pop up with some brief questions for you. And again, thank you very much for joining us. Have a good rest of your day or evening.